Hello friends, my name is JJ and I am finally back home after spending an entire month in fabulous Washington, D.C. In a truly bizarre twist of fate, I wound up going on my big month-long holiday, the first substantial holiday I have taken from this channel in many years, during the 1 month that Canada has made more international news than it has in at least a decade. I refer, of course, to the Great Truckers' Protest of February 22. During the last month, I was subject to an endless flurry of requests, both from you guys and people in the mainstream media who wanted to hear my take on the whole thing, which was very flattering because I know I have established this reputation as Mr. Canada over the years. And in ordinary circumstances, Canadian affairs are indeed my favorite thing in the world to talk about, but it proved a uniquely challenging thing to do amid all of the travel and the various other projects I had going on in DC, and frankly, just my desire to take things easy for a bit. But anyway, I am now finally back in Canada, and the trucker protest is basically over, which I guess I can spin as actually being the perfect time to talk about the issue, because we are now a bit further removed from it. So let us get into it. Okay, so for anyone who needs a quick refresher, on January 28th, 2022, hundreds of truckers in big rigs, comprising something they called the Freedom Convoy, descended upon the city of Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. At the protest's peak, there were over 500 trucks occupying this so-called red zone, which is the downtown core of the city, around many of the most important government buildings, including the Parliament of Canada. The downtown occupation, in turn, choked off many other streets, including commercial and residential areas, making a significant chunk of the city all but inaccessible. There is currently a class action lawsuit of local businesses affected by the blockade, claiming over $306 million in damages. The trucker occupation lasted for 3 weeks and quickly assumed a carnival-like atmosphere. There was music and a bouncy castle and a hot tub and barbecues and all the rest of it, and lots of honking. My God, the honking. There was actually a whole other class action lawsuit just to get them to stop. In short, the truckers were incredibly obnoxious, and that's not just me passing judgment. This was a protest, so the goal was very much always to be loud and annoying, both to get attention and also to have something to use as leverage with the authorities. While the truckers in Ottawa got most of the attention, it is worth noting that there were smaller copycat protests in other parts of Canada as well. The most notable was a trucker blockade that was set up on the Ambassador Bridge for 7 days. The Ambassador Bridge being the busiest point of cross-border trade between Canada and the United States. There was also a similar border crossing protest in Coutts, Alberta, and one in Emerson, Manitoba, plus lots of smaller solidarity rallies in scattered cities across the country. All right, so now let us get to the $10 million question. What were they protesting? This is a question I tend to be pretty cautious about when it comes to large-scale protest movements, not just in Canada, but in other countries too. I visited Santiago a few years ago when they were in the midst of a very intense protest movement of their own, and in the ensuing video I made, I tried to emphasize how these protests weren't really about a single thing per se, but rather a sort of broader expression of left-wing malaise towards the perceived corruption and indifference of the Chilean system more broadly. I think the Canadian truckers' protest is best thought of in a similar way. It is perhaps best understood as a movement of broad right-wing malaise towards the perceived oppressions that Canada's governments have imposed on the public during the COVID-19 pandemic. In theory, the spark that triggered everything was Prime Minister Trudeau's decision in early January to require all truckers returning to Canada from the US to be fully vaccinated.
Truckers will have to be fully vaccinated to enter Canada.
Come Saturday, new rules mean unvaccinated truckers entering Canada will be subject to testing and quarantine.
Everyone, every trucker entering into Canada or every Canadian or American trucker transiting to Canada must be vaccinated.
The tighter restrictions put an estimated 10,000 truckers off the road, but the actual number is likely much higher.
Prior to that, truckers had been exempt from the vaccine mandates because they were considered an essential service, and the Trudeau decision was accordingly quite unpopular with the trucking industry.
Unvaccinated drivers have been delivering loads since March of 2020 because as essential workers, they've always been able to go.
But that said, it quickly became clear that the vaccine mandate was really just the pretext for a much more wide-scale protest against the idea of COVID restrictions more broadly. A manifesto posted on the Freedom Convoy convoy Facebook page and signed by the two people usually described as the ringleaders of the protest, listed 4 key demands: an end to vaccine passports and all other obligatory vaccine contract tracing programs, an end to vaccine mandates, cease the divisive rhetoric attacking Canadians who disagree with government mandates, and cease to limit debate through coercive measures with the goal of censoring those who have varying or incorrect opinions. Or, as a fellow in a viral video summed it up,
the honking will continue until freedom improves. Simple as that.
From the start, the truckers singled out Prime Minister Trudeau as their main enemy, with Trudeau flags a particularly ubiquitous presence. This gave the protests a pretty partisan tint, but it also made them an important symbol of the broader drift of right-wing politics into a more populist direction, as explained in this quote from Rich Lowry, who's a famous American political commentator. The sense now is less, the government is bankrupting us, and more, these out-of-touch, self-appointed experts are telling us what to do because they have too much power and like lording it over us, with the press, social media, corporations, and nonprofits all on their side. Because it was such a large protest, however, there were other factions and other arguments being made as well, embodying other strains of right-wing thought, a particularly prominent one being conspiracism. People sometimes ask me if there are any uniquely popular conspiracy theories in Canada, and I usually reply by calling attention to the so-called sovereign citizen type stuff, which is when people put forward these theories that because, the Canadian Constitution was signed the wrong way in 1921 or whatever, all of our laws are actually illegitimate and the government doesn't actually have any power to arrest you if you break one of their phony laws and so forth. Early on in the protest, there was a petition circulated by a certain faction of the truckers and signed by over 320,000 online supporters that offered a fairly bizarre interpretation of the Canadian political system in which the Canadian Senate and Governor General were called on to assert powers they do not have and create a weird new interim government for Canada that would then repeal all of the COVID restrictions. The Governor General, in particular, who is the representative of the British Queen in Canada, became a particular subject of fascination by this set and was bombarded around the clock with demands to fire Prime Minister Trudeau. This is also not remotely within her authority to do, but crazy theories about the power of the Crown often play a prominent role in Canadian conspiracy theories of this flavor. Now, regardless of how persuasive or not you find any of this stuff, in many ways, the much more significant thing about the truckers' protest was just that it involved truckers. Leaving aside the question of how representative a convoy of a few hundred trucks was of the interests or opinions of Canadian truckers in general, who are a huge and diverse community, the most relevant variable explaining why it had the impact that it did was just that it used trucks. Parking gigantic trucks in a city's downtown core in a fashion designed to cause maximum obstruction and frustration was undeniably an extremely creative and unprecedented tactic that proved remarkably effective, at least in the short term. On February 7th, the CBC published a good piece that described in considerable detail how towing a giant truck is difficult or almost impossible without the driver's cooperation, and even harder still when the tow truck companies themselves are refusing to offer their services out of solidarity or fear.
Several independent contractors and companies have publicly supported the convoy and are refusing to tow trucks in the protest. Those who have offered assistance are being threatened.
We could very easily make a whole other video just analyzing the power of the protest from this sort of technological, logistical perspective, but I think it is probably a pretty underrated angle of their success overall. So what gave the truckers such an innovative idea? Some pundits, such as David Frum, the famed Canadian-American political commentator, has speculated about this a fair bit, and I think his argument is pretty persuasive.
The prelude to a lot of what happened in Ottawa was a year and a half where through 2020 there were increasingly intimidating acts of interruption of essential services, pipelines and rail by other kinds of protesters farther from urban Canada. And the federal government of Justin Trudeau, largely looked the other way. And that set the table for what has happened here.
What he is describing is something that I am very intimately familiar with, living here in the province of British Columbia, which has been the site of enormous anti-oil and anti-gas activism over the last few years. Even during the trucker protest itself, there was a fairly violent protest in the northern part of this province at a natural gas site where mass protesters smashed up a bunch of property in an effort to disrupt the project. So the conclusion would be that there has been a slow normalization in Canada of the politics of, I guess we would call it like physicality, for lack of a better term. The idea of using physical blockades and physical obstruction and even physical destruction as a means in which a minority faction can get their political views across. And as Frum alluded to, there's also a kind of jealous both sidesism going on, wherein the Canadian right perceives the left as having gotten away with these sorts of tactics for too long and are now willing to call the government's bluff by using them themselves. All right, so now let us talk a little bit more about the whole partisan angle to this thing. The angle of the truckers' protest as a symbol of the poisonous polarization of left versus right politics that is becoming so ubiquitous everywhere these days. I wrote a few columns about the protests in my capacity as a columnist at the Washington Post. And in this one, I talked a lot about the degree that the truckers had a uniquely traumatizing effect on people on the Canadian left or even center because of the way they embodied such a galling rejection of what had previously been assumed to be pretty solid public support for Canada's COVID policies. As I put it, a festival of partisan division and anti-government bombast in the nation's capital is a painful unraveling of presumed consensus when the country's politicians and journalists have leaned so heavily on confident rhetoric of cooperation and unity to get through the pandemic. Canadian COVID policies have not been the strictest in the world by any stretch, but they have been fairly uniform across the country, with basically every province having a similar regime of mandatory masking and vaccine passports and targeted shutdowns, regardless of what party was in charge. There was likewise a lot of coverage in the Canadian press that presented such policies as not only broadly popular, but patriotic, easy, and natural for Canadians to follow, because Canadians supposedly are just inherently passive people who love doing what they're told. The line I will always remember was from this 2020 editorial from the Toronto Star, Canada's biggest newspaper, declaring, "At core, our national DNA favors the collective during a crisis that has demanded collective action, mutual sacrifice, looking out for the other, rather than insistence on personal liberty and pursuit of happiness." At one time, this sort of thing was being published everywhere, alongside plenty of America bashing, which of course is always hard to escape in this country. The idea being that while Americans were acting like wild yahoos, screaming about freedom and refusing to wear masks, Canadians were obediently whipping out their vaccine passports to visit their local library or whatever. But then the truckers happened, and suddenly a lot of progressive Canadians were aggressively reminded that this country does indeed contain plenty of people flamboyantly opposed to vaccine mandates and all the rest of it. Liberal columnists accordingly went from praising our national DNA to writing morose things like, "Blight no more, the world sees Canada very differently now," or "The Canadian flag as a national symbol has been critically injured," you know, because the truckers waved it. Although, I will note that one popular cope to all of this was casting the truckers as being fundamentally foreign, which is to say American, either by calling attention to how much money they were getting from Americans, which one study suggested was almost half of their fundraising, or by making more chauvinistic arguments about how Canadians had been radicalized by their proximity to American politics and media. For example, here is a piece from the New York Times that quotes a man named Gerald Butts, who was, and I suppose still is, one of Prime Minister Trudeau's closest advisors. For 2 years, Canadians have been largely stuck at home, and many have spent more time in front of the screen than ever. As they did, they absorbed the American culture war being played out from Fox News to Breitbart, and Trumpian ideas took root in Canada, said Gerald Butts, a longtime friend of Mr. Trudeau's and his former top political aide. Now, as the weeks went on and the city, provincial, and federal authorities looked more and more helpless to remove the protesters from Ottawa, more and more attention came to be focused on what I would call the QAnon faction of the movement. Initially, Prime Minister Trudeau had sought to denounce the truckers by focusing on their supposed bigotry, characterizing the movement as fundamentally racist and sexist and so forth.
Conservative Party members can stand with people who wave swastikas. They can stand with people who wave the Confederate flag.
And while some truckers did indeed infamously wave Confederate or even Nazi flags, Trudeau wound up getting a fair bit of pushback from the press and public for this particular line of rhetorical attack. I suspect because it struck a lot of people as a somewhat gratingly tendentious take from Trudeau, who tends to talk this way about everything. To most people, the worst thing about the truckers was just how horribly obstructive they were, and Trudeau's numbers have accordingly taken a bit of a dive recently as he shoulders a fair chunk of the blame for not moving swifter to deal with them. But the Prime Minister did move swiftly in the end. On St. Valentine's Day 2022, Prime Minister Trudeau invoked a very controversial piece of legislation known as the Emergencies Act that gave him short-term emergency powers to quell a public order emergency.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations.
No Canadian Prime Minister had done this sort of thing in more than 50 years, the last one actually being Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who had proclaimed a national emergency to deal with a flare-up of French-Canadian separatist violence in 1970. I would say that the younger Trudeau's emergency was probably less controversial than the old man's, only because the scope of government's emergency powers have been considerably watered down post-1970, and the truckers had become so broadly disliked by this point that the polls suggested the public was open to just about anything to get rid of them, but more about that later. In any case, as I said, to justify this unprecedented move, the Prime Minister and his people shifted to playing up the fear that the truckers actually posed a significant threat to Canadian democracy. Growing attention was given to the allegation that they wanted to overthrow the government in particular, which, as we discussed earlier, there was at least some theoretical interest in. But the day the Emergency Act was invoked also brought a bit of a darker tone to something that had previously been easily dismissed as just a kind of crankish, crackpot conspiracy theory after the police seized a large cache of weapons from one of the copycat protests at the Alberta-Montana border. The government claimed that this was proof of the real and present danger of the protests.
What we're beginning to see emerge now are the hallmarks of a sophisticated and capable organization of a small number of individuals, but with a steel resolve, driven by an extreme ideology that would seek to overthrow the existing government and create some kind of parallel structure. Looking back over the course of the last number of weeks, and more importantly, seeing the developments of the arrests and seizures that have been made this past week, there's a real danger in trivializing and diminishing exactly what's going on here.
The emergency declaration was popular with the public, but polarizing among the political class. When Prime Minister Trudeau eventually asked the Parliament to extend his emergency powers beyond the initial 7-day window he could proclaim unilaterally, the Liberal and NDP parties voted in favor, while the Conservative Party and separatist Bloc Québécois voted against. I suspect that the Bloc voting against had a lot to do with lingering animosity over the way that emergency powers were used to round up French-Canadian nationalists in 1970, which remains a sore spot with Quebecers to this day. In any case, the emergency powers pretty much worked. Once they were invoked, the government was able to basically just declare the truckers' protest illegal and arrest anyone participating in it. They could also finally legally compel those in different towing companies to remove the trucks and force the truckers to cooperate under penalty of serious fines or prison. In all, 196 protesters were arrested, 115 trucks were towed, and over 3,700 fines were levied. The emergency powers have now been revoked, Ottawa is back to normal, and Canada's brief moment as a subject of global curiosity and pity has ended. The truckers quickly became right-wing folk heroes to many Canadian conservatives, most of whom don't live in Ottawa, and thus had the luxury of observing the protest primarily as a grassroots pro-freedom movement that had arisen in opposition to a prime minister they hated. Many conservative politicians were accordingly keen to try to cozy up to the truckers, arguing that they shared their concerns about the oppressive nature of COVID restrictions. During the heat of the protests, the Conservative governments of Saskatchewan and Alberta both announced that they would be repealing all of their COVID restrictions the following month, a move that was probably on track to happen anyway, but was nevertheless framed on both sides as a sop to the truckers' influence.
It starts with truckers, but it goes far beyond truckers.
Some of the leaders of the trucker convoy had also made the explicit demand that Aaron O'Toole, the moderate head of the Conservative Party, be fired.
If they were smart, they would pull Aaron now, right now, get him out of there.
And on February 2nd, this happened too.
The whole stuff around the trucker convoy, I think, just added to the pressure and showed just what a weak leader he was.
Though again, many might say that this was probably just going to happen anyway. The new acting leader of the party, and the guy who everyone suspects is likely to be the next permanent leader, have both been far more aggressive in their opposition to COVID restrictions than O'Toole ever was.
Governments have taken advantage of COVID to try and take away our freedom and give themselves more power.
The fact that the Conservatives have chosen to interpret the truckers as basically the heroes of this story has some observers wondering whether this is particularly good politics for the Canadian right, given that the truckers were never particularly well liked by the broad Canadian public. Conservatives in turn respond by calling attention to recent polls showing that Canadian public opinion has turned sharply against COVID restrictions, meaning the truckers' cause might still be a winner, even if the truckers themselves are not. Given that Prime Minister Trudeau's popularity has taken quite a hit from his perceived mismanagement of the protest, the Conservatives are mostly feeling empowered by how things have played out. And talking of polls, lastly, I just want to call your attention to some rather stark numbers regarding how the Canadian public thinks that unruly protesters should be handled. I think this gets at one of the most underreported aspects of the Canadian public, which is just how much support there tends to be in this country for harsh treatment of troublemakers. A Maru poll found 64% of Canadians supporting the idea of using the army to remove the truckers from the capital city. A solution considerably more extreme than anything Trudeau actually did, even with the emergency powers. 67% agreed with the statement, "It's time to clear out the protesters in Ottawa, even if it means people who will not leave may get hurt or worse." This tracks quite closely with the sort of polling data that we've seen in response to some of the environmental protests of the past that so irritated David Frum, suggesting that the relevant issue in the eyes of most Canadians is the fact that people are protesting in an obstructive or disruptive manner rather than the cause that they're protesting for. It strikes me as a reflection of just how rigidly order-obsessed the broad Canadian middle class tends to be. It's a tendency that I do feel we should all keep an eye on because it can go in some rather dark places if left unchecked. For instance, a different Maru poll offered up this option. "Regardless of my politics, I would vote for a strong-willed person to have enforceable law and order," in what I think was obviously supposed to be a testing of the water of the authoritarian instincts of the Canadian public. Yeah, and it got 71% in favor. Protests do have the capacity to change politics, just not always in the way that the protesters themselves expect.